Well, I want that. Okay. So I don't often talk about narcissism because the minute that word comes up, immediately there's like a witch hunt going on. I've seen people use words like narc to describe people. Like, what? That's like a drug police force. Okay. Like, I have a totally different position on narcissism than probably every love and relationship coach has. And it is that the only reason we tend to associate avoidance with narcissism is because anxious narcissists are louder in pointing the finger, quite frankly, because insecure attachment is at its basis a narcissistic wound. Okay, so if you want to learn more about that, I invite you to check out Kohut, Hans Kohut, and his research on self and self objects. And basically, what is narcissism? Narcissism is a reaction formation. Narcissism is when you have not had your essential self mirrored back to you in any way at an early age. And so as a result, your sense of self becomes very tied up in the mirrors of the people around you, because that is how you learned how to survive. So, for example, there are phases of what's called normal narcissism in human development. And in early development, this is a phase where all children have a sense of grandiosity about themselves. Look, mom, I'm a Superman. Look at me fly. And they tie a cape around their or blanket around their neck, and they jump from the couch to the cushions to the chair, and like, ooh, look at me go. And there's any number of ways a parent can respond to that. Okay, so let's give you the severe ends of the spectrum. Oh, look at you. Look at Superman go. Look how strong you are. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have, what are you doing? Shut up. Sit down. You're ruining my furniture. You are not Superman. You are just a little kid, and you're nothing but a burden to me. Okay. So, what happens is when we have the clapping parent, then the child over time and through life experience will come to understand their limitations. They will come to understand what Spitz calls the brick wall of reality, right? We can't help it. That's just what reality does to us. But in the other circumstance, they sort of prematurely get chopped down, right? That like I said before, that play process is cut off prematurely. And so whatever inner impulse or inner exploration of capacity and capability and imagination and considering the possibilities and weighing our own capabilities against the possibilities and what the physical world will allow versus what I can internally envision is cut off, not acceptable. And it is deemed so by the people who are the supreme authorities in your life. And so the messages that are communicated are that you are not worthy, you are a burden, you are this, you are that. And so there are, so that's a narcissistic wound, your sense of self. And so you respond in a few different ways. Grandiosity, that grandiosity can respond by getting turned up to full volume, because if you're not grandiose, if you don't think that high of yourself, then the opposite must be true, and you fall from a great height and you will never dig yourself out of that hole. So you have to kind of live up there, and anyone who tries to contest it, you reject, because if you don't have that, then you're nothing, and nothingness is nothingness. Okay. On the other hand, then you have more what are called covert narcissistic displays, and that's where you fall and then you use the victimized position to elicit a response from the mirrors around you. So what do we describe as, narcissistic avoidance? Is dismissal of people's feelings, negating of this and all of that. But I hope you realize, and especially after the video that we just did on fearful versus dismissive avoidance, that those examples in particular of the enmeshed family systems that I gave you, a lot of those characters could be described as anxiously attached, but they're narcissistic in nature. Okay. So I have a very different position on narcissism, and I am not one to go on a witch hunt for people who have that kind of diagnosis. And if you have the diagnosis, by the way, it means that you just have a cluster of symptoms that were severe enough to meet that criteria. Meanwhile, let's talk a little bit about diagnosis. Diagnosis is just that you have a certain number of traits that cluster over here more often than not, as opposed to over here. But you could have like 2 or 3 of the same traits, but just because you've got these extra 2 over here happening, you get lumped with this label and diagnosis as opposed to this label and diagnosis. Narcissistic personality disorder is just a level of intensity. It just means that it is far more intense. This is like when you go to school to learn how to be a therapist by the time, or a doctor. By the time you get out of school, you're like, I have this, this, and this, and this, and this. And it's because that when you learn about diagnosis, what you learn is we all exist on these same spectrums, all of us. All of us. And what happens is when you get a diagnosis is when you start hanging out on any one end of the spectrum more often than not. And you hang around there so often that it's starting to negatively impact your life, relationships, and functioning. So I don't like to talk about these things diagnostically or categorically so much because it's not the God's honest truth. And of course, there is statistical research that goes through and looks at frequency of attitudes and behaviors, but we also have to keep in mind the context in which research is conducted. We also have to keep in mind the framework in which it is interpreted, okay? And you also have to keep in mind that diagnosis is not like the end all be all truth of everything. And so insecure attachment is by its very nature a narcissistic wound. Even secure people have healthy degrees of narcissism. You have to. If you didn't have a healthy degree of narcissism, you couldn't walk across the room and ask somebody out on a date. We wouldn't have people willing to assume leadership positions. We wouldn't have people like, creative powerhouse people who think of something outside the box that doesn't already exist and put on that cape and try to jump from the couch to the chair because they believe for that moment that I am Superman and I am grandiose enough to think that I could create something in this world that doesn't yet exist simply because I can conceive of it. As a society, we become conditioned to emphasize the other and the external above everything else to the point of self-abandonment. Okay. And when we experience that, it is a narcissistic wound. So when anxious individuals look to their partners to validate them, to make them feel like they're okay, to make them feel like they're needed, to make them feel comfortable and secure in the relationship, because otherwise they don't feel that way, that's a narcissistic mechanism. When an avoidant person rejects people, doesn't want them close, doesn't want this, doesn't want that, because otherwise they feel beholden to make them feel better because they can't tolerate the discomfort of their feelings, that's also a narcissistic wound. Because at the basis of it, we are struggling to define our boundaries around self and other. And the thing is, unless you can define those boundaries around self, any act of selflessness is actually quite selfish, because so much of who you are is tied up in what they are doing, what they are saying, and how they are acting and how they are not acting, okay? And so because now what they do and say and think and all of that impacts you so much, you can't help but be selfish in your every action, because whatever they do, you have an investment in it. So they now can't really trust you either, because they know that you're just doing it because they want it. So how do they know that you really love them? How do they know that you even see them for who they are? Because you're just so busy looking at who you are in relationship to them. And sometimes I hear people saying things like, I just give and I give and I give and I get nothing back from this relationship. And unless they start giving me something, I'm just going to be exhausted and depleted and this doesn't work for me. And so then what do? I need to get away to recharge. What is recharging about that? So what you're saying is, okay, so trying to find energy in all the wrong places that only deplete me isn't working. So I'm going to go back to my eternal source of energy, which is myself. I need time by myself to recharge. That's because you are the deepest and most eternal source of energy that you have. And unless you can remain in touch with it and you can start to play with and define the boundaries of what that is for you, then your relationships will continue to deplete you because you continue to try to access the energy from them. And that's not where your source energy comes from.